Hi there. Okay, so we're back again. This is our third reading. It's The Transformation of Silence into Language and Action by Audre Lorde. It's an excerpt from the book, The Cancer Journals. To preface a little bit about this, this was written in 1978, and during that period of time, and actually well into the 1990s, the country of South Africa, which is on the very southern tip of the continent of Africa, had a legal system called apartheid. And apartheid literally means apart in skin and apart in color, actually. And it was taking our Jim Crow laws of, for coloreds only and for whites only, and it actually codified it into the laws. There were places that only Black people could go. There were places that white people could only go. Black people were not allowed to talk out against the government, none of that. They had very little lives, honestly, outside of the labor that they were doing, and mostly in crappy jobs like mining, things like diamonds and asbestos, which we now know causes really bad cancer. Okay, so know that that's what she's talking about. Okay. So, paragraph 1. I would like to preface my remarks on the transformation of silence into language and action with a poem. The title is A Song for Many Movements, and the reading is dedicated to Winnie Mandela. Winnie Mandela is a South African freedom fighter who is now in exile somewhere in South Africa. She had been in prison and had been released and was picked up again after she spoke out against the recent jailing of Black school children who were singing freedom songs and who were charged with public violence. A song for many movements. Nobody wants to die on the way caught between ghosts of whiteness and the real water. None of us want to leave our bones on the way to salvation. 3 planets to the left. A century ago, our spices are separate in particular, but our skins sing in complementary keys. At 7:45 meantime, we are telling the same stories over and over and over. Broken down gods survive in the crevices and mud pots of every beleaguered city where it is obvious that there are too many bodies to cart to the ovens or gallows, and our uses have become more important than our silence. After the fall, too many empty cases of blood to bury or burn. There is nobody left to listen, and our hard labor has become more important than our silence. Our labor has become more important than our silence. I have come to believe over and over again that what is most important to me must be spoken, made verbal, and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood. That speaking profits me beyond any other effect. I am standing here as a Black lesbian poet, and the meaning of that waits upon the fact that I am still alive. It might not have been. Less than 2 months ago, I was told by 2 doctors, one female and one male, that I would have to have breast surgery, and there was a 60 to 80% chance that the tumor was malignant. Between that telling and the actual surgery, there was a 3-week period of the agony of involuntary reorganization of my entire life. The surgery was completed and the growth benign. Anytime that you are diagnosed with a really serious health ailment, you tend to rethink how your life is being run, or at the very least, if you're given something like a terminal diagnosis or a possible terminal diagnosis, you find yourself trying to reorganize your life in a way that will help your loved ones move forward without you. So let's go paragraph 6. But within those 3 weeks, I was forced to look upon myself and my living with harsh and urgent clarity that has left me still shaken, but not much stronger. This is a situation faced by many women, by some of you here today. Some of what I experienced during that time has helped elucidate or teach for me much of what I was concerning the transformation of silence into language and action. In becoming forcibly and essentially aware of my mortality, or the fact that I was going to die, and of what I wished and wanted for my life, however short it might be. Priorities and omissions became strongly etched in a merciless light, and what I most regretted there were my silences. Of what had I ever been afraid? To question or to speak as I believed could have meant pain or death, but we all hurt in so many different ways, all in the time, and the pain will either change or end. Death, on the other hand, is a final silence, and that might be coming quickly now, without regard or whether I'd ever spoken what needed to be said or had ever betrayed myself into small silences. While I planned someday to speak or waited for somebody else's words, and I began to recognize a source of power within myself that comes from the knowledge that while it was most desirable not to be afraid, learning to put fear into perspective gave me great strength. So, what she's saying here is that, especially growing up in a place that she grew up in South Africa, speaking out could mean that you were thrown in jail or tortured or killed. So she often was silent out of fear. And what this great fear of possibly dying has taught her is that while she had gone out of her way to feel less afraid and that she planned on someday speaking up about what was important, she began to recognize that while it's desirable or nice not to be afraid, sometimes putting fear into perspective, whereas suddenly fear of death is much more close than it would have been before, gave her a sense of strength. Okay, paragraph 8. If I was going to die, if not sooner than later, whether or not I had ever spoken myself, my silences had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you. But for every real word spoken, for every attempt that I'd ever made to speak those truths for which I am seeking, I had made contact with other women while we examined the words to fit in a world in which we all believed, bridging our differences. And it was concern and caring of all those women which gave me strength and enabled me to scrutinize the essentials of my living. So, what she's saying here is now that she was sitting here and now she honestly thinks she's dying soon, she realizes that being silent in the past had not protected her. And she's telling you that your silence is not going to protect you either. But she realized that for every time that she did speak up about things that mattered, about things that mattered to women and about race, that she made bridges with other women mostly in a world that they believed was going to change the world they lived in. And now it was that concern about her and that caring of all those women that she'd made connections with that gave her strength and enabled her to scrutinize or take a really hard look at the essentials of her living. Okay, paragraph 9. The women who sustained me through that period were Black and white, old and young, lesbian, bisexual, and heterosexual. And we all shared a war against the tyrannies of silence. They all gave me a strength and concern without which I could not have survived intact. Within those weeks of acute fear came the knowledge within the war we are all waging with the forces of death, subtle and otherwise, conscious or not. I'm not the only casualty. I'm also a warrior. Okay? Something else I didn't mention at this point, being gay or lesbian or bisexual in South Africa under apartheid was also illegal, can have you jailed. So she has a couple of strikes against her. And that the women who were supporting her were the gamut of all people. It didn't matter. So while she was going through that extreme fear of dying, she realized that she was not only a casualty of the silence, but she was also a warrior for these women and for this new world she wanted to see. Okay, paragraph 10. There are the words you do not have yet. What do you need to say? What are the tyrannies you swallow day by day and attempt to make your own until you sicken and die of them, still in silence? Perhaps for some you are here today, but I face of one of your fears because I am woman, because I am Black, because I am lesbian, because I am myself, a Black woman warrior poet doing my work. Come to ask you, are you doing yours? Okay. Tyranny, she's talking about what are those things about society or the culture in which you live in that oppress you and that you internalize and make you sick. And some people believe can actually make you physically ill if you're constantly bearing those emotional things. And that she could also be standing in front of these people that she's talking to, a sense of their own fear because she represents all of these things. She's Black, she's lesbian, she's a poet, she's a Black woman warrior doing her work and demanding to ask you if you're doing yours. Okay. Paragraph 11. And of course, I am afraid. You can hear it in my voice because the transformation of silence into language and action is an act of self-revelation, and it always seems fraught with danger. But my daughter, when I told her of our topic and my difficulty with it, said, tell them about how you've never really a whole person if you remain silent, because there's always that one little piece inside of you that wants to be spoken out. And if you keep ignoring it, it gets madder and madder and hotter and hotter. And if you don't speak it out one day, it will just up and punch you in the mouth. Okay, so why it is important to speak your reality, your truth. Paragraph 12, in the cause of silence, each one of us draws the face of our own fear, fear of contempt, of censure, of some judgment, or recognition, of challenge, of annihilation. But most of all, I think, we fear the very visibility without which we cannot truly live. Within this country, where racial difference creates a constant, if unspoken, distortion of vision, Black women have one hand always been visible, and so on the other hand, have been rendered invisible through the depersonalization of racism. Even within the women's movement, we've had to fight and still do for that very visibility which rends us most vulnerable, our Blackness. For to survive in the mouth of this dragon we call America, we have to have learned this first and most vital lesson, that we were never meant to survive, not as human beings. And neither were most of you here today, Black or not. And that visibility, which makes us most vulnerable, is that which makes us the source of our greatest strength. Because the machine will try to grind you into dust anyway, whether or not we speak. We can sit in our corners mute forever while our sisters and ourselves are wasted, while our children are distorted and destroyed, while our earth is poisoned, while we sit in our safe corners mute as bottles, and we will still be no less afraid. Okay? Here she's talking about that we all do tend to have our fear, and by being silent and not talking up for the things that we care about, be it climate change or ending racism or Black Lives Matter or the women's movement or equal rights for equal pay for equal work, whatever it be, even if we remain silent, nothing changes. In fact, we add to the non-changing. Even though we keep our personal safety, we don't change anything for ourselves or our children. Paragraph 13. In my house this year, we are celebrating the Feast of Kwanzaa, the African-American festival of the harvest, which begins the day after Christmas and lasts for 7 days. There are 7 principles of Kwanzaa, one for each day. The first principle is umoja, which means unity, the decision to strive for and maintain unity in self and community. The principle for yesterday, the second day, was kujichagulia, self-determination, the decision to define ourselves, name ourselves, and speak for ourselves, instead of being defined and spoken for by others. Today is the 3rd day of Kwanzaa. It is the principle for today is ujima, collective work and responsibility, the decision to build and maintain ourselves and our communities together, and to recognize and solve our problems together. Each of us is here now because in one way or another, we share a commitment to language and to the power of language and to reclaiming of that language which has been made to work against us. In the transformation of silence into language and action, it is vitally necessary for each one of us to establish or examine her function in that transformation, to recognize her role as vital within that transformation. Okay, this is very similar to the letter from the Birmingham jail by Dr. Martin Luther King. You have to make yourself the people who society tries to make invisible, or who a government tries to make invisible. You have to understand that you are part of the change, and you need to understand your role is vital within that change. And a big part of making change is simply using the language of change and no longer being silent. Okay. Paragraph 15. For those of us who write, it is necessary to scrutinize not only the truth for what we speak, but the truth of the language by which we speak it. For others, it is to share and spread also those words that are meaningful to us. But primarily for us all, it is necessary to teach by living and speak those truths which we believe and know beyond understanding, because in this way alone we can survive, by taking part in the process of life that is creative and continuing. That is growth. Okay. So here she's also talking about, specifically as writers, that we need to deal with the language and be true to the language that we use and how we speak it. It's just simply that we need to live life. And by living life, that's a process that is creative and continuing. So that means personal growth. Okay. Paragraph 16. It is never without fear of visibility, of the harsh light of scrutiny, and perhaps judgment, of pain, of death. But we have lived through all those already in silence, except death. And I remind myself all the time now that I were to have been born mute, or if I had maintained an oath of silence my whole life long for safety, I still would have suffered and would still die. And it is very good for establishing perspective. Okay, so it's always fearful or possibly dangerous to make yourself visible, to be the person who speaks out, to be the one that people see. But even if you have remained silent your entire life, you're still going to die. And having that diagnosis that was hanging over her, possibly dying of cancer, really changed her perspective on this. Paragraph 17. And where the words of women are crying to be heard, we must, each of us, recognize our responsibility to seek those words out, to read them and share them and examine them in their pertinence to our lives, their connection to our lives, their strength in our lives, that we not hide behind the mockeries of separations that have been imposed upon us, and which is so often we accept as our own. For instance, I can't possibly teach Black women's writing. Their experience is so different from mine. Yet how many years have you spent teaching Plato and Shakespeare and Proust? Or another, she's a white woman, what could she possibly have to say to me? Or she's a lesbian, what would my husband say? Or my chairman? Or again, this woman writes of her sons and I have no children. And all the other endless ways in which we rob ourselves of each other. So just because people are different from you, that doesn't mean that their words cannot affect you, and that their living and their truth can't somehow affect you in a positive way. And we need to be opening to listening to people who are different from ourselves. Paragraph 18, and we can learn and speak when we are afraid in the same way we have learned to work and speak when we are tired. For we have been socialized to respect fear more than our needs for language and definition. And while we wait in silence for that final luxury of fearlessness, the weight of that silence will choke us. So if we wait until forever to actually finally speak up when we're finally in a situation that there's going to be no fear, then we will die of our own silence. Paragraph 19. The fact that we are here and that I speak now these words is not an attempt to break that silence and bridge some of those differences between us, for it is not difference which immobilizes us, but silence. And there are so many silences to be broken. So it's not that we're different from each other, it's simply that we don't talk to each other. That's what creates those divisions between us. So we need to be able to speak. We need to be able to speak our truth, and we need to be heard by people. And we need to be willing to hear people who are different than ourselves. Okay, we'll meet with that next reading.